A homecoming service ended in chaos when a pastor was shot inside the sanctuary. The shooter wasn't a stranger off the street. She was someone he knew well, someone tied to months of secrecy and tension. Investigators quickly realized this wasn't just a crime of the moment, it was the result of choices, lies, and warnings ignored. What they uncovered would leave his family shattered, his congregation stunned, and a hidden life exposed piece by piece. The annual homecoming service in a small North Carolina town was meant to be a day of reunion and celebration. Families had gathered early, the sanctuary filled with laughter, greetings, and the sound of choir rehearsals drifting from the front. For many, this was the biggest Sunday of the year, a time when former members returned to reconnect and honor tradition. But as the congregation settled into the service, the atmosphere shifted in an instant. Moments before he was scheduled to speak, Pastor Anthony Miller moved toward the pulpit, exchanging handshakes with familiar faces along the aisle. Witnesses later recalled seeing him pause near the front pews when a woman approached. It seemed unremarkable at first, until raised voices carried across the sanctuary. A sharp, escalating exchange silenced the crowd, and within seconds, the unthinkable happened. Gunshots rang out inside the church. Congregants dove beneath pews as children screamed and adults scrambled toward the exits. Pastor Miller fell to the floor, struck multiple times in the chest. Blood spread quickly across the carpet as the sound of chaos filled the building. Some rushed forward in disbelief, while others froze in shock, unable to process what they were witnessing. The shooter did not flee. She stood just a few feet away, her arms still raised, the revolver in her hand trembling as churchgoers shouted and cried out. That woman was Danielle Brooks. Emergency calls flooded local dispatch. Within minutes, first responders arrived to find Anthony lying motionless at the front of the church, surrounded by frantic parishioners. Officers quickly secured Danielle, handcuffed her, and escorted her from the building as shocked witnesses looked on. She offered no resistance, only muttering under her breath as she was led away. Paramedics worked frantically on Anthony, performing chest compressions as his wife and children stood in disbelief a few feet away. He was rushed into an ambulance and taken to a nearby hospital, but for those left inside the church, the damage was already clear. The homecoming service had turned into a crime scene. By the end of that afternoon, word of the shooting spread quickly through the town. A respected pastor had been killed during one of the most important services of the year, and the woman accused of pulling the trigger was not an outsider. She was someone connected to him in ways the community would soon learn, ties that stretched back months and would unravel into a web of secrets no one had anticipated. In the days following the shooting, investigators and community members alike were forced to reconcile two very different images of Anthony Miller. To the public, Anthony was a figure of stability. He had grown up in the same town where he later served, a familiar face who mentored young men, counseled struggling families, and was often seen at local events lending support. Neighbors described him as approachable, a man who remembered names and made people feel important in his presence. His family portrait, a wife of more than 20 years and children preparing for college, reinforced that impression of respectability. Anthony's reputation extended beyond the church. He volunteered at local food drives, supported after-school programs, and occasionally appeared at town council gatherings to open meetings in prayer. To many, he was the kind of man you wanted nearby in times of crisis, steady, charismatic, and composed. In the week before homecoming, he had even been praised publicly for his efforts in raising scholarship funds for neighborhood students. On the surface, he was the image of a community leader. But investigators quickly learned that Anthony's private life told another story. Beneath the polished image were choices that complicated everything people thought they knew about him. Phone records painted a trail of late-night calls to a number not associated with his wife. Bank statements revealed transfers that had little to do with family bills or community programs. As detectives began piecing things together, it became clear that Anthony had been living a double life, one carefully maintained in public, and another hidden from nearly everyone who trusted him. Friends closest to him recalled subtle cracks in the facade. One former colleague mentioned that Anthony often appeared distracted, scrolling through his phone during meetings and leaving abruptly for emergencies no one could verify. His wife had once quietly separated from him for nearly a year, citing vague marital difficulties, before the two reconciled. Those details hadn't drawn much attention at the time, but in hindsight, they suggested a deeper strain. Family finances also hinted at hidden stress. While Anthony's outward appearance was well kept, tailored suits on Sunday mornings and a modest but comfortable home, behind the scenes, money was tight. College tuition for his eldest child loomed, and there were whispers of credit cards carrying balances higher than they should have been. Still, no one suspected the reason for the missing money until the investigation exposed the financial entanglements he had kept secret. As news spread about the shooting, the community's first shock was not only the violence itself but the idea that someone like Anthony could have been tied so closely to the woman who pulled the trigger. The disconnect between the man they believed him to be and the reality investigators were uncovering left parishioners stunned. For many, the question became less about why someone wanted to harm him and more about what he had been hiding all along. The connection between Anthony Miller and Danielle Brooks did not begin inside the church walls. Investigators later learned they met through a mutual acquaintance at a small gathering in town nearly 2 years before the shooting. Danielle was younger, single, and known for her bold personality. Anthony, already established as a family man and community figure, appeared cautious at first. But what started as casual conversations soon developed into frequent meetings away from public view. Early records showed the two exchanged phone numbers that same week. Within months, call logs reflected late-night conversations stretching hours, and text messages that hinted at more than friendship. Danielle confided to a friend that she finally had someone who could take care of her, while Anthony began making excuses to leave home unexpectedly. For Anthony, it was a dangerous mix of attraction and escape from mounting pressures at home. For Danielle, it became an expectation of support. Financial dependency quickly grew into the foundation of their relationship. Bank statements reviewed by detectives revealed that Anthony began transferring small sums to Danielle early on, first under the pretense of helping with utilities, then with more significant amounts covering her rent. In one instance, he co-signed for her car, a move that tied him directly to her financial responsibilities. To Danielle, these gestures were proof of his commitment. To Anthony, they were a way of controlling the situation and ensuring her silence. Witness interviews painted a picture of a relationship that was neither hidden well nor entirely stable. Friends recalled seeing Anthony at restaurants outside their neighborhood with Danielle, careful never to linger too long. Others mentioned that Danielle boasted about having someone important looking after her, though she rarely said his name. Detectives later noted that Anthony's sudden disappearances from family events aligned closely with his phone records connecting to Danielle. Over time, Anthony's involvement with Danielle became less about companionship and more about obligation. The money flowed steadily, and her reliance on him deepened. When payments arrived late, Danielle became vocal, sending him messages filled with accusations and demands. Investigators uncovered voicemails where her tone shifted from affectionate to angry, warning him that she wouldn't be treated like nothing. These messages highlighted the imbalance of the relationship. Danielle felt entitled to his financial support, while Anthony felt trapped by the expectations he had created. This arrangement might have continued quietly if not for Anthony's growing financial strain. With household bills, tuition looming for his children, and other hidden commitments, The steady flow of money to Danielle became unsustainable. But instead of ending things carefully, Anthony began pulling back abruptly, ignoring calls and blocking her online. That shift, investigators would later say, became the first spark of a conflict that escalated far beyond what he imagined. By the time of the homecoming service, Danielle was no longer just a hidden affair. She was a woman scorned, financially dependent, and increasingly unstable. Their meeting years earlier, seemingly insignificant, had set into motion a chain of events that would culminate in one of the town's most shocking crimes. As detectives moved beyond Anthony Miller's public image and into the details of his private life, the clearest pattern they uncovered was financial. What began as small, quiet gestures toward Danielle Brooks had grown into a web of obligations that entangled not only his personal accounts but also the resources tied to his role in the community. Investigators first traced steady transfers from Anthony's checking account directly into Danielle's. At the start, the amounts were modest, a few $100s at a time, often explained away in messages as helping out. Within a year, the sums had grown larger. Rent payments appeared every month, closely aligned with Danielle's lease schedule. Detectives also discovered that Anthony had co-signed for a car in her name, a commitment that extended beyond casual generosity and linked his financial record to hers in ways he could not easily escape. The deeper they looked, the more troubling the trail became. Beyond his personal contributions, Anthony had also begun diverting funds from discretionary accounts tied to church outreach. On paper, these payments were labeled as community assistance or benevolence, the kinds of expenses that would not raise suspicion in routine financial reports. But bank records showed withdrawals in amounts nearly identical to the transfers Danielle was receiving. It created a parallel pattern. One account used to mask the depletion of another. Forensic accountants later confirmed what the paper trail suggested. Anthony was covering Danielle's lifestyle with a mix of his own income and funds never meant to leave church accounts. While the misuse did not appear to extend to large sums, the steady drip of money into Danielle's control over 2 years became impossible to ignore. What made matters worse was Danielle's increasing reliance on that support. Witnesses recalled that she often referred to Anthony as someone who looked after her bills, and she had grown comfortable enough to boast about it among friends. Investigators pieced together text messages where Danielle reminded him of due dates, insisting she couldn't afford to fall behind. Each payment reinforced a cycle. She demanded, he complied, and in exchange, silence about their relationship was preserved. By the time Anthony's family finances began to strain, his obligations to Danielle had locked him in. His wife, unaware of the affair, had already noticed household funds stretched thin. Tuition bills and mortgage payments competed with obligations she didn't know existed. For Anthony, the pressure mounted. Ending the arrangement was not as simple as walking away. Danielle was deeply tied to his credit, his money, and his reputation. Investigators would later conclude that Anthony's decision to cut Danielle off financially was not abrupt but born of desperation. He could no longer balance the costs of maintaining 2 households, the one he shared with his wife and children, and the shadow one sustained by Danielle's demands. When he finally stopped the payments, the effect was immediate. Danielle was not only without support, she was left with debts linked to his promises. It was a decision that, while meant to protect his family's future, only intensified the danger he faced. The financial entanglement he had created over 2 years became the very chain Danielle used to pull him into a conflict that ended in violence. As detectives traced the history of Danielle Brooks, a troubling pattern began to emerge. She was not an unknown figure to law enforcement or to those who had crossed her path in the past. Interviews with former acquaintances and a review of court records revealed a reputation marked by volatility, unstable relationships, and behaviors that hinted at deeper issues long before she ever met Anthony Miller. Years earlier, Danielle had filed for a restraining order against a former boyfriend, claiming he harassed her and refused to leave her alone. But police records painted a more complicated picture. While she described herself as the victim, officers noted multiple calls from the same man alleging that Danielle had shown up at his job, left threatening messages, and followed him after their breakup. The order was eventually dismissed, leaving a trail of suspicion about who was truly the aggressor. Neighbors from a prior apartment complex recalled frequent arguments that carried into the night. One woman told investigators that Danielle often screamed on the phone, pacing in the parking lot, accusing men of betraying her or not providing enough. Another recalled broken windows and a string of police visits, each one connected to Danielle's personal disputes. To those who lived nearby, she was known for heated outbursts that seemed to escalate quickly over minor disagreements. Former friends described her as someone who formed intense attachments, often too quickly, and reacted strongly when she felt slighted. A pattern emerged of relationships beginning with charm and excitement but deteriorating into accusations and demands. In several instances, Danielle had confronted women she believed were rivals, sending hostile messages or making unannounced appearances at their workplaces. Detectives reviewing these accounts noted that her fixation on control and attention was not new, it was part of her established behavior. Her reputation in social circles carried the same edge. On social media, Danielle frequently posted emotional updates, messages that swung between affection and anger, often directed at unnamed men. Friends later told investigators they dismissed these posts as typical venting. But in hindsight, they formed a trail of warnings about her volatile state of mind. What tied all these accounts together was the way Danielle reacted when she felt abandoned or unsupported. Investigators concluded that she displayed patterns of obsession, a cycle that intensified when her financial security was tied to her relationships. With Anthony Miller, that cycle found its most destructive expression. He was not the first man to experience her volatility, but he became the one who paid the ultimate price when her expectations were no longer met. By the time the shooting occurred, Danielle's past was not just background information, it became evidence of what investigators described as a dangerous personality prone to escalation. For Anthony, ignoring these warning signs and entangling himself financially had placed him in the path of a woman with a long history of instability. Behind the public image of harmony, Anthony Miller's home life was far more fragile than most realized. His marriage had already weathered a storm years before, when his wife discovered late-night calls to another woman. Though Anthony denied any serious wrongdoing at the time, the tension was enough that the two lived apart for nearly a year. Family pressure and church expectations eventually pulled them back together, but the trust that had once defined their relationship never fully returned. In the years that followed, Anthony's wife became quietly suspicious again. She noticed his frequent absences, excuses about meetings that stretched into the night, and the habit of keeping his phone close at all times. Small signs that might have been overlooked by others carried weight in a marriage already marked by past betrayal. At the same time, financial pressures pressed in on the family. Their eldest child was preparing for college, and tuition bills loomed over a household budget already stretched thin. Mortgage payments and everyday expenses competed with dwindling savings. Anthony's wife often questioned why their finances felt strained despite his steady income and occasional speaking honorariums. His answers, vague explanations about unexpected costs or helping others in need, left her unsettled, but without proof, her concerns remained quiet suspicions. What she never knew was that Anthony's responsibilities extended beyond their immediate family. Investigators later uncovered that he had been supporting a second child from a previous relationship, a fact he had concealed even from his closest relatives. Payments made quietly over the years went unnoticed until the financial trail was mapped out in the aftermath of his death. That hidden obligation not only added to his financial stress but also explained the gaps in his accounts that his wife could never reconcile. These layers of secrecy deepened the strain at home. While Anthony's wife maintained the appearance of a stable marriage for the sake of their children and community, she was increasingly unsettled by the inconsistencies she observed. Friends recalled her confiding that something wasn't adding up, though she never imagined the extent of the deception. For Anthony, home became another place of mounting pressure. Balancing the expectations of a wife already wary, the needs of his children, and the weight of financial commitments he couldn't admit to, he carried burdens that were impossible to sustain. The presence of Danielle Brooks in his life, and the financial entanglement she represented, only made the cracks at home more severe. By the time of the homecoming service, Anthony's marriage was standing on fragile ground. What his wife saw as unexplained distance and financial strain were the visible signs of a double life that would soon be exposed in the most devastating way possible. By the spring of 2012, Anthony Miller reached a decision he felt was necessary but dangerous. After nearly 2 years of financially supporting Danielle Brooks, the strain had grown unbearable. Household bills were rising, his wife's suspicions were deepening, and obligations tied to his hidden second child were becoming harder to conceal. Cutting Danielle off was the only option he saw left. For 3 months before the homecoming service, the payments stopped. What followed was a steady escalation that investigators later described as a countdown to violence. Phone records revealed dozens of missed calls each week. Danielle's messages shifted from pleading to hostile, accusing Anthony of using her and abandoning her when she needed him most. Friends reported that she spoke openly about being cast aside and vowed that he wouldn't get away with it. For Anthony, avoiding her calls only fed the anger brewing on the other end of the line. Danielle also turned to social media. Her posts became cryptic but pointed, filled with bitterness that seemed directed at an unnamed man. One message read, "Don't feed someone for years and expect them to starve quietly." Another warned, "Secrets always surface. Some with blood." At the time, these updates were dismissed by those who saw them as outbursts. In hindsight, they were clear signs of the storm building. Her hostility reached beyond Anthony himself. His wife began receiving anonymous calls, silence on the line followed by abrupt hang-ups. On one occasion, flowers appeared on the porch of their home with a note that read only, "Liar." Anthony's daughter also received an anonymous text telling her to ask your dad where his money really goes. None of these incidents were formally reported, leaving no official record until after the shooting. Investigators later pieced these actions together as harassment designed to pressure Anthony back into compliance. Danielle had grown financially dependent on his support, and when it disappeared, her anger shifted into desperation. Without his payments, she was left with bills she couldn't manage, including the car he had co-signed. To her, the cutoff wasn't just the end of an affair, it was a betrayal that exposed her to collapse. Privately, Anthony confided to a cousin that he felt trapped, admitting that Danielle knew too much about his finances and feared she would ruin him. He had no idea that her threats were already spilling into the lives of his family. The decision to cut her off, meant to shield his marriage and reputation, instead fueled a spiral of retaliation. By the end of that 3-month stretch, Danielle's resentment was no longer hidden. She confronted him in public spaces, left angry voicemails, and warned mutual acquaintances that she intended to make him answer for what he did. For investigators retracing the final weeks, the signs of escalation were obvious. Anthony's refusal to send money had not only broken their arrangement, it had set in motion a chain of threats and harassment that made violence almost inevitable. As the pressure from Danielle Brooks escalated, Anthony Miller reached out to one of the few people he believed he could trust, his cousin. Investigators learned through interviews and text records that Anthony confided in him during the summer of 2012, describing the situation as something he couldn't get out of clean. He admitted that Danielle knew far too much about his finances, his movements, and even his use of discretionary church funds. To Anthony, it felt like he was boxed into a corner, with every decision carrying the risk of exposure. The cousin, however, was not simply a listening ear. Months earlier, he had put Anthony in a compromising position of his own. Facing a $5,000 debt, the cousin had threatened to reveal Anthony's secrets unless he helped cover it. Anthony complied at the time, quietly providing the money to keep the matter contained. That arrangement left him even more vulnerable. He knew that if Danielle didn't ruin him, his cousin could. The threat of exposure was no longer limited to one person. It came from two different directions, each pulling at the fragile secrecy of his private life. Detectives later noted how this subplot revealed the growing instability in Anthony's world. He was living under layers of silence and transactions, paying Danielle to maintain her loyalty, supporting a second child in secret, and handing over thousands to a relative who had used his vulnerabilities against him. To investigators, this was the point where Anthony's double life became unsustainable. With every secret came another person who could use it against him. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Danielle Brooks left behind a series of warnings that, in hindsight, appeared unmistakable. Yet at the time, they were dismissed or overlooked by those who saw them. Investigators later described this as one of the most troubling aspects of the case, a trail of signals that went unreported, leaving no official record until after the violence had already occurred. On social media, Danielle's posts became increasingly cryptic and hostile. She shared late-night messages about betrayal, trust broken, and debts unpaid. One post read, "Funny how people eat off your plate then forget you exist." Another declared, "Secrets only stay buried if no one digs." Friends who saw the updates brushed them off as emotional venting. To them, it was nothing unusual. Danielle had always been vocal about her feelings online. No one imagined these words were directed at Anthony Miller, or that they foreshadowed the danger to come. In her personal interactions, Danielle's behavior was just as concerning. Neighbors recalled her pacing outside her apartment while shouting into her phone, raising her voice at someone she accused of abandoning her. Others noticed the pattern of visitors who stopped showing up after tense arguments, a cycle that seemed to repeat every few months. These moments were passed off as typical relationship drama, not indicators of escalation. Anthony's own family encountered warnings that they too dismissed. His wife received anonymous calls, sometimes only silence on the line, other times the sound of breathing before a hang-up. She grew uneasy but told no one outside her immediate circle, assuming it was a prank or mistake. His daughter's anonymous text, "Ask your dad where his money really goes," was shrugged off as mischief, not recognized as a direct threat tied to Danielle's anger. Despite these signals, no police reports were filed. Detectives found no prior complaints lodged against Danielle in the months before the shooting, no formal record that might have triggered intervention. Without documentation, the threats existed only as fragments: posts online, conversations overheard, and messages ignored. For investigators, the absence of official reports meant Danielle's escalating behavior unfolded unchecked. Friends and family underestimated her volatility, assuming her words were exaggerated expressions of frustration rather than indicators of intent. In reality, each ignored post, call, and note marked another step toward the violence that erupted at the homecoming service. By the time the first shot rang out inside the sanctuary, the red flags that could have prompted action had already been scattered across weeks of public and private warnings. Only after the tragedy did those who had seen them recognize their meaning. What had once looked like empty anger was, in fact, the visible unraveling of a woman preparing to carry out her most destructive act. Once Danielle Brooks was taken into custody, detectives began the process of understanding how a respected pastor had ended up gunned down during one of the community's most important services. The first step was gathering the evidence scattered across Anthony Miller's personal and financial life. What investigators uncovered would dismantle the image many held of him and reveal the complex web that had drawn Danielle to the point of violence. Detectives obtained a warrant for Anthony's phone and quickly uncovered extensive communication with Danielle. Logs showed hundreds of late-night calls and text exchanges over nearly 2 years. Some of the messages were affectionate, but many turned hostile in the weeks leading up to the shooting. Voicemails retrieved from Danielle's number contained threats thinly veiled in emotional pleas. One message warned that Anthony would regret ignoring her. Another accused him of throwing her away like trash. These recordings formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, evidence of intent and escalation. Bank statements told a parallel story. Regular transfers to Danielle's account were documented, aligned with her rent payments and other expenses. In one striking detail, investigators discovered that Anthony had disguised withdrawals from discretionary church funds, labeling them as community outreach disbursements. Those amounts nearly matched the deposits into Danielle's account. To prosecutors, this was proof that Anthony's affair had gone beyond personal betrayal. It involved misuse of entrusted money. Danielle's reliance on that financial support, and Anthony's decision to cut it off, became the clear motive for her actions. The financial review also exposed another hidden burden. Alongside the payments to Danielle were transfers supporting a second child from a past relationship, something Anthony had concealed from his wife and congregation. Detectives confirmed the existence of the child through interviews and documentation. This revelation deepened the picture of Anthony's double life, a man balancing 2 households, a secret child, and an unstable affair that drained him both emotionally and financially. When confronted with the evidence, Danielle did not deny the relationship. In recorded interviews, she admitted to being involved with Anthony and confirmed that he had supported her financially. She stated flatly that he walked away when she needed him most, and admitted to bringing the gun to the service. Her words were chilling in their simplicity. He thought he could cut me off. I wasn't going to let that happen. Detectives described her demeanor as cold, without remorse, and entirely focused on her perception of betrayal. As the investigation unfolded, the community struggled with the contrast between the Anthony they knew and the realities exposed by evidence. Parishioners who once saw him as a role model now had to confront the fact that he had misused church money, maintained a secret child, and lived a life far removed from the one he preached about. For his family, the investigation confirmed suspicions they had long sensed but never fully uncovered. By the close of the investigation, the picture was clear. Anthony Miller had built a life on secrecy and deception, and Danielle Brooks had responded to her financial and emotional dependency with violence. For detectives, the motive was straightforward, but the story was layered. A respected leader undone by private choices that collided with the obsession of a woman he could no longer control. In the months that followed the shooting, the shock that gripped the small North Carolina town deepened into painful reckonings. Danielle Brooks was formally indicted on charges of first-degree murder and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Her trial drew careful attention from investigators and the community alike, not for spectacle, but for the need to understand how such a public tragedy could have been set in motion. During the trial, prosecutors presented phone logs, bank statements, and Danielle's own recorded confession. Jurors heard the threatening voicemails in her voice, reviewed the financial transfers that tied her directly to Anthony Miller, and examined records showing the misuse of church funds. Danielle took the stand briefly, but her testimony did little to sway the jury. After only 4 hours of deliberation, she was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, citing premeditation, her lack of remorse, and the devastating impact on Anthony's family and congregation. For Anthony's wife, the trial confirmed the betrayals she had only suspected. She learned not only of the affair but of the financial deception and the existence of his second child. Friends described her as devastated, yet determined to protect her children from the weight of their father's secrets. Family members split over how to remember Anthony. Some clung to the image of the man who had guided them spiritually, while others could not reconcile that with the lies his double life exposed. The story closed with no heroes, only fractured lives. A pastor once admired was remembered with a complicated legacy. A family was left to navigate betrayal alongside grief. A congregation was forced to rebuild from mistrust. And a woman who demanded loyalty at the point of a gun now faced the rest of her life behind bars. The tragedy stood as a chilling reminder: hidden lives rarely remain hidden, and when secrecy collides with obsession, the result can be public destruction.